Hey everybody. It's pretty late. It's almost midnight on Sunday, February 20th. I wanted to record this because unfortunately I don't think I'm going to make the meeting this week. This is a tough week for me anyway. Originally, we were going to hold the meeting next week, and then we decided Thursday and then Monday, and I ended up just deciding I don't know if I'm even going to do office hours this week because I have a conference on Saturday, and uh, I'm not done writing my paper, so I'm doing a lot of that. But I did want to contribute since this is um, obviously a topic that I helped pick, so I wanted to make sure I contributed. But it may not be a bad thing for me not to be there. I know I'm usually at the meetings, and even though I'm an introvert and all that, but I think when I'm in the meetings, sometimes I might tend to dominate without meaning to. So maybe it's good, maybe it's good to have you guys talk amongst yourselves instead of me talking. I wanted to do two quick things. I posted two documentaries. Obviously, you're not going to get a chance to watch these before you guys meet. But I wanted to go ahead and post these, and I'll just talk about those in just a second. But the other thing I wanted to talk about also, since you guys read a book by Jeffrey Toobin on OJ, which is still considered, even though it's almost 20 years, over 20 years old now, it's still considered kind of the best book on the OJ trial. We haven't really gotten to the point of historians jumping on board yet. It's only just now that I think historians are going to start looking at this. But Toobin's for now is the best. But there are other books out there, mostly from the time period. So these would be almost primary sources. But if you are interested in this topic beyond Jeffrey Toobin, I would recommend a couple of these. Christopher Darden, for one. I mean, he was one of the earlier ones to actually publish, and this is actually a good read. And obviously, it's completely from his perspective, including why he had to OJ put the glove on. Actually, and I think every lawyer in the case wrote a book. I think of the lawyers, of the participants, actually, even though a lot of people have mixed feelings on Marcia Clark, I actually kind of like her. But I think this is actually a really good read. She did have a co-author, but by the way, she now is a novelist, a crime novelist. And her novels are actually pretty good. But I really like this book a lot. There was an early book that came out by academics, and it's called Postmortem, looking at various aspects of the case. It's an old book now, but it is interesting how academics were looking at the book when it first came out. Again, Toobin's is still, I really consider, the best. But there is another one. This is just one version of it, called American Tragedy by Lawrence Schiller. And it's glaring, isn't it? And what's interesting is the picture on this particular version of it is from an earlier TV movie that came out, I think, in 1999 about the OJ. So there's Made in America is the documentary, then there's the American Crime Story. All right. There you go. Not restarting it. We're gonna leave it in. But this is, a lot of people was kind of forgotten about this, and it's a giant book. Gosh, what is it? Almost 1,000 pages, but it is excellent as well. This author actually worked directly with the defense lawyers. So literally was there with the defense lawyers. And I've already talked about Dominic Dunn, the reporter who was also present at the trial. So there's a lot of good books on this beyond Jeffrey Toobin's. But Jeffrey Toobin's, I think, is the easiest read, but also very authoritative. So anyway, I just wanted to throw those out there if you're interested in this particular topic. Let me quickly talk about the documentaries that I posted. Like I said, there's two of them. And the whole purpose of these is a little bit of a build-up to this OJ trial. I kind of hope I am still going to do a couple more short videos later, but I kind of hope to do a little bit more of this before you guys had a chance to talk. And my plan was always to post these this week, but again, I originally thought we were going to meet next week. But anyway, to give you guys a little bit of background, even though it may be after the fact, at the 25th anniversary of something known as the LA riots, which happened in 1992, so 2017, a couple of documentaries had come out, which are excellent. And I posted both of them. The main one I want you to watch is called Let It Fall, LA 1982 to 92. And this is a traditional documentary where there's historical footage, but there's also the talking heads, you know, the participants or even historians or reporters sort of talking about what's happening. The other one that came out the same year, but it's also excellent, even though it's the same subject matter. They even use some of the same footage. It's called LA 92, which it wasn't really made by National Geographic, but they funded it. This one is interesting because there's no narration, there's no talking heads. It is only news footage. And this one covers basically two things. It covers, and I'll explain both of these in a moment if you're not familiar, but it covers something known as the Rodney King beating and then the LA riots. But again, there's like no commentary. It's just primary sources. And it sounds like it would be boring, but it is riveting. But what's fascinating about it is that you're kind of living it as it's happening. No one's explaining to you what you should be thinking. You're experiencing it as though you were compressing time and living through it in real time. But the events that these guys are talking about, both of these, I think it's important to understand that the O.J. Simpson trial, which, and most of the time we talk about it as like, did he do it? Did he not do it? What's the evidence? What was the trial like? What was OJ's relationship with his wife before the murder, you know? And that's great because it is fascinating to take one case and look at all the aspects of it. But the thing to keep in mind, my point with these two documentaries is that, and I really, really want you to watch at least one of them. And between the two, this one, LA 92, is probably the better one, but I think you'll get more out of this one. But the purpose of posting these is that O.J. Simpson trial, the murder and trial, was not an isolated incident. This was part of a larger mosaic of events happening in Southern California and also to the rest of the country. So, and don't worry, I'm not going to lecture these. I'm just going to kind of mention some of this. I mean, you can really trace what's happening with OJ is going all the way back to 1965 with something known as the Watts riot, which is Watts being a black area of LA, where there was some police brutality, which sparked a major riot, the first kind of major race riot in the modern era, really. This is, again, pretty early on in 65, but we'll see several in the late 60s. And again, a lot of the imagery is very similar to what we will see in 1992 and what we'll see in 2020 as well. And it sparks a lot of the same debates about police brutality, about looting, about proper ways to express your anger at the government and society. Anyway, so, you know, you keep in mind 1992, Watts riots was only 25 years before then. You know, we're at the 30th anniversary of the LA riots. And at that time, it was only 25 years earlier. And again, I remember LA riots like they just happened, even though it's been 30 years. So Watts riots were very much in the minds of people in Southern California at this point. There's a couple of major incidents that happened in the early 80s, which the documentaries get into, but I think the most relevant to the O.J. Simpson trial is a couple of incidents that happened in the early 90s. And again, you know, to kind of understand where the jury was coming from, where the media was coming from, where a lot of participants were coming from. So for instance, in the early 90s, I believe 91, there was an incident at a grocery store in LA. There were a lot of Korean immigrants into Southern California, and many of them, because they couldn't open up in some of the nice areas, but they could afford to open up in some of the poor areas, they opened up a lot of liquor stores and grocery stores. And there's a lot of tension between the Korean merchants and the local Black residents. I mean, you know, this was a real thing. And anyway, there was an incident where a 15-year-old girl was in an argument with the owner of a store, this older Korean woman. The woman accused the teen of stealing some orange juice, even though the security footage clearly shows she was trying to pay. She throws the orange juice down on the counter, starts to walk away, and the clerk shoots her in the back of the head and kills her. And this sparked a trial and a lot of, and she was then found innocent. And that sparked a huge debate and over fairness. I mean, again, this stuff sounds kind of relevant to what we talked about 2020 and 2021. So there's that. But the really big, and some people have made the connections in the past and in recent years between people like Emmett Till, Trayvon Martin, Latasha Harlins, even though the Latasha Harlan story has, outside of LA, has been pretty much forgotten about today. Although there's a really well done book by Brenda Stevenson, a Southern historian who works a lot on slavery issues and segregation issues. She's written on this particular incident. But again, it's still kind of relatively unknown, I think, to most Americans today. But during the OJ trial, this would have been something people would have been thinking about. And again, it gets into justice, and is there racial bias in justice, and but really the big one is, of course, something known as the Rodney King beating. And again, I'm old. I mean, I was 19 when this happened, and this was a big deal. And again, it most people my age and older, you can say Rodney King, everybody knows what you're talking about. But I think for a lot of people, especially those born 10 years after the fact, like most of you, this may not have resonance with you. So Rodney King was an African-American who had some issues, but for the most part was not a bad guy for the most part, but he did have some drug problems and some other issues. And he was speeding. The police began to chase him. He panicked and sped more. Eventually, he did pull over, and the police proceeded. 4 officers proceeded to beat him. Now, they've always claimed that he kept getting up, even though they told him to lay down. But whether Rodney King should have laid down or not, I mean, but you watch the videotape, and I'll come back to that. You watch the videotape, and there's no getting around that. I mean, it's hard to watch that and feel justified that the police were doing something right there. What's interesting about this is that it was videotaped. This pre-cell phones, late 1980s was the beginning of people having, in fact, I have an old one. I meant to break it out. I forgot. Video cameras. And so this was one of kind of the earliest viral videos, pre-internet, pre-cell phone. But the idea of a regular person filming something and then it becoming a story. Pretty much every major story today, especially when it deals with race and police, is almost always somebody with their cell phone filming it. Before cell phones, it was video cameras. And it is rough footage to watch. And Rodney King was severely beaten. He did survive it, though. And of course, there was a trial of the 4 officers. And as many of you may know, they were found, again, initially the trial was moved out of LA to another community, to an all-white community. And that was controversial, but they were found innocent. And, a lot of people blame Daryl Gates, the police chief, LAPD chief on the right there, somebody whose name pops up a lot during the during the O.J. Simpson trials. And of course, that trial, the beating caused tension. And then a year later, when the trial happened, and they were found innocent, that sparked a massive riot, which echoed a lot of the Watts riots. And when you watch this footage in the documentaries, I think it's hard. The documentaries are hard not to get angry. You get angry at some of the injustices that are clearly happening, but you also get very angry at a lot of the violence that the rioters are doing. Probably the most infamous footage was the footage of a truck driver, a white truck driver who accidentally just drives into this thing. Some people pull him out. They begin to kick him, beat him, dance around. And this kind of becomes, along with the Rodney King beating a year earlier, this kind of becomes sort of the flip side, if you will, for the LA riots. Although in that particular incident, the person did survive that. And actually an African-American named Bobby Green ended up rescuing that truck driver from that situation. So there's also heroes in the story. But again, these are brutal stories. I'll stop here. But again, I know Tubi gets into this a little bit, but I think watching both of these documentaries put you into the mindset of the time. Not only maybe a lot of the Black anger at the time and anger at the justice system, anger at the police, but also a lot of white anger on the flip side, especially with the riots. There was a lot of misunderstanding, a lot of probably justifiable anger of, it just, I mean, the debates that we're still having to this day. What is the proper way to handle injustice? What is the proper way of getting your voice heard? I mean, this is debates we've been having for decades, and I think we're still going to have them. So it is interesting that about every 25 to 30 years, I mean, we see we saw what happened in the 60s, and then the late 80s, early 90s, and now the early 2020s. It does seem like I don't really believe history is cyclical, but it does feel like we're going in these cycles. It's almost like every generation goes through this. Anyway, enough of that. I talked way too much. I just want to give you guys a sense of these. And sorry, I'm not going to be there this week, but again, sometimes it might actually be better. Let other voices be heard. So here's my voice, and now it's time for you guys. So anyway, remember on March 7th, a Monday, we're going to be going to Tallahassee. It'll be earlier that day. It'll be 1 o'clock is when we need to be in Tallahassee. But anyway, that's a couple of weeks from tomorrow. So I'll try to remind you guys over the next few days. Okay, thanks. Oops. I always hate this awkward. All right, now I can end it.